What we're witnessing in Venezuela isn't democracy versus authoritarianism. It's the latest chapter in America's desperate attempt to maintain economic hegemony through increasingly counterproductive means.
It is very concerning that the Trump administration is not putting the opposition and the sort of the will of the Venezuelan people first. Right now, what's being put first, at least in terms of the objective or the goal of post-Maduro Venezuela, is oil.
Ante el genocidio que se ha iniciado contra el pueblo palestino en Gaza.
Maduro urged, quote, a moral and political response to the atrocities being committed against the Palestinian people amid unprecedented impunity. He further condemned Israel, calling it a, quote, killing machine, and the war in Gaza a genocide. Rarely has the truth been said so eloquently by a leader at so high a level.
Welcome to Demystifying Iran. Following the kidnapping of President Maduro, and during a period of protests and riots in Iran, two highly revealing statements surfaced. On Fox News, retired U.S. General Jack Keane asserted the implications here are really great for Israel. He almost said Israel before swiftly correcting to the Venezuelan people. Almost simultaneously, former CIA Director Mike Pompeo posted a pointed tweet. Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets. Also to every Mossad agent walking beside them. Given that U.S. policy in West Asia and North Africa is obviously aligned with Israeli interests, and considering that even the aggression against Venezuela is also deeply linked to those interests, it seems prudent to re-examine the case of Syria. On December 29th, after meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, President Donald Trump made a striking public statement. He was standing there with the Israeli regime's prime minister by his side, and he credited Turkey's President Erdogan with playing a positive and key role in the goal of overthrowing Syria's former leader Bashar al-Assad. Then Trump added this, that Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed with him. They shared this positive assessment. Trump characterized the militant leader in Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, also known as Ahmad al-Shara, as someone he supports. He expressed hope that Netanyahu could establish a good relationship with him.
I will try and make it so that they do get along.
Previously, Netanyahu had attributed the collapse of the Assad government primarily to the Israeli regime's military pressure, asserting that collapse is the direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran. Now, Jolani is no ordinary figure. He was until recently a wanted commander. His group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was until recently designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S., and there was a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head. And here's the striking part. Even with that terrorist designation and bounty, the U.S. never made any attempt to kill him. This is a man who co-founded ISIS, a man whose group in Syria before rebranding was Al-Qaeda's Syria branch. The same Al-Qaeda that we were told carried out their terror attacks on September 11th, 2001, killing roughly 3,000 Americans. Yet for over a decade, Iran's involvement in Syria has been one of the most criticized aspects of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. Across NATO and among U.S. regional allies and proxies, it was consistently framed, judged, and condemned, conveniently in the language of sectarianism, a language that served to obscure the roles of the U.S. and Israeli regimes. Western media, think tanks, and their counterparts in the pro-Western camp across the region pushed a singular story, one of Iranian expansionism and sectarian ambition. But then there was the beheadings and slave markets, a takfiri regime with U.S. support that burned its way across borders. This raises a critical question. Was the arrival of Iranian advisors in Damascus in 2013 an act of foreign intervention, or was it a collective fight for security against a U.S.-led regime change operation? Nevertheless, it is clear that Iran's presence in Syria and soon after in Iraq was not the start of a problem, but a response to one. To understand Iran's presence in Syria, you must first look at the uprising of 2011. On the surface, it was a continuation of the Arab Spring, beginning with legitimate calls for reform. Bashar al-Assad from the Syrian Ba'ath Party was a secular leader outside the Western camp. In those early days, Iran saw him as just that, a leader facing a domestic crisis. Iranian officials openly advised him and his colleagues to implement reforms, avoid brutal repression, and find a political solution. At the time, Assad, in fact, had a closer relationship with Arab and Turkish leaders than with Iran. He shared a personal friendship with Turkey's Erdogan. They and their families even vacationed together. Yet as the uprising escalated, into this vacuum flowed an extraordinarily well-funded foreign legion of extremists. Overwhelmingly, they were from al-Qaeda or ideologically aligned with it. And many of these very fighters would soon become the founding core of ISIS. For Tehran, watching this swift transformation, the calculus shifted. Iran saw that what followed was not an organic movement. It was the orchestration of a proxy war, one whose primary infantry would be takfiri so-called jihadists, backed by the U.S. and its regional allies. Notably, most of these allies were authoritarian family regimes that had suddenly found their voice, screaming for freedom in Libya and Syria. Iran's decision was not made in a vacuum. It was guided by a strategic doctrine. This doctrine required three things. First, a formal invitation from the Syrian government. Second, a just cause, defined as the defense of a people against U.S.-led aggression and takfiri terror. And third, a strict mandate to support, advise, and empower local forces, never to replace or occupy them. While Iran saw an existential threat to the region, key architects of American policy saw a strategic opportunity.
It was shocking and a betrayal to me and every person who was killed on 9/11, their families and my brothers and sisters in uniform. When, as a member of Congress, I learned about President Obama's dual programs that he had begun really to overthrow the regime of Syria, and being willing to, through the CIA's Timber Sycamore program that has now been made public, of working with and arming and equipping al-Qaeda in an effort to overthrow that regime, starting yet another regime change war in the Middle East.
A chilling articulation of this view came from inside the Obama administration. In a February 2012 email, a senior State Department official named Jake Sullivan, who later became President Biden's national security advisor, wrote to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, AQ, al-Qaeda, is on our side in Syria. Their policy was regime change. Fresh off the ouster and murder of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, the administration and its allies trained their sights on Damascus. A 2012 U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document stated that U.S. regional allies were explicitly attempting to establish a Salafist entity in eastern Syria. And in a striking admission, the agency's then Director General Michael Flynn later stated in an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, that the Obama administration had supported this policy. In early 2013, this broader U.S. covert effort to support the Syrian opposition and pressure the Assad government was officially designated by the code name Timber Sycamore. Authorized by Obama and run by the CIA, it became one of the largest covert action programs in history. It ran in parallel with the enormous flow of funding and weapons provided by U.S. regional allies through Turkey and Jordan.
According to U.S. officials, the program was run by the CIA's Special Activities Division and has trained thousands of rebels. President Barack Obama secretly authorized the CIA to begin arming Syria's embattled rebels in 2013. The program became public knowledge in mid-2016. Critics saw it as ineffective and expensive and raised concerns about diversion of weapons to jihadist groups and about Timber Sycamore-backed rebels fighting alongside the al-Nusra Front.
Significantly, on the Turkish-Syrian border in 2014, a Lebanese-American journalist for Press TV named Serena Sem reported that trucks from the World Food Program were being used to smuggle ISIS fighters and arms into Syria. Shortly after her expose, she was accused by Turkish intelligence of being a spy. She denied the accusation during a live broadcast, expressing deep concern for her safety. Just hours later, on October 14, 2014, she was killed in a very suspicious car accident. Weapons, money, and intelligence flowed through this covert pipeline. But the weapons supplied by the U.S. and its regional allies, including the regime in Tel Aviv, were mostly deployed by the jihadist factions. In essence, this became a sprawling arms market, fueling the very terror networks America had vowed to destroy after 9/11. This proved that Iran's narrative that it was fighting a U.S.-backed Takfiri army was not propaganda. It was a grim reality. And as usual, alongside this dirty war, the U.S. and its allies imposed crippling sanctions, ultimately after years of conflict, and while occupying Syria's oil fields. The U.S. imposed the Caesar Act in 2020, a final economic blow designed to crush what remained of the Syrian economy and bring the nation to its knees. Today we see the very same tools being deployed against the people of Venezuela, Iran, Yemen, and Cuba, albeit with less success. The dirty war along the Syrian-occupied Golan Heights involved a complex patchwork of opposition factions, ranging from Free Syrian Army units to Salafi jihadist groups like HTS and ISIS. Since at least 2013, the Zionist regime established a covert mechanism for treating wounded fighters from these factions in field hospitals along the border. Estimates suggest thousands of combatants received advanced care.
In his interview with the British Sunday Times, however, Eisenkot continued that the weapons shipments to rebel groups consisted of light munitions for self-defense, while a September report by Foreign Policy magazine quoted alleged Syrian rebel leaders and soldiers as saying Israel was arming and funding at least a dozen different groups.
The support, however, extended far beyond medical aid. In 2017, the Wall Street Journal published detailed on-the-record accounts from fighters within these groups. They described the relationship that included regular monthly cash to commanders, salaries for fighters, and the systematic supply of necessities like food, fuel, and medical equipment. Critically, the supply chain also included weaponry intended to sustain these groups' operational viability against Syrian government forces. The tactical coordination could be stark and direct. When a partnered faction suffered a major battlefield loss, Precise Israeli artillery strikes or air raids would often follow, targeting Syrian Arab army positions and weaponry in the same area. This was more than support. It was a real-time military offset, punishing advancing Syrian forces and effectively serving as an external artillery brigade for select proxies. As the U.S.-led coalition funneled support to Takfiri factions, the task of confronting them fell to the forces of Iran and the resistance. On the front lines against the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, one figure commanded the ground campaign in both Iraq and Syria, General Qasem Soleimani. His operational impact was decisive. In Syria, Soleimani was the architect of the militias that broke the deadly HTS-led siege of Aleppo. Later, he orchestrated the massive, complex operation that recaptured the strategic city of Deir ez-Zor from ISIS, a victory that shattered the group's territorial grip and prevented U.S. forces from filling the vacuum along the Iraq-Syria border. In 2014, as ISIS stormed towards Erbil and Obama refused to help, it was General Soleimani who arranged the urgent delivery of Iranian weapons and officers to the Kurdish Peshmerga, preventing a catastrophic collapse. Yet his most significant creation was not a battlefield victory, but an extraordinary army. He assembled a unique transnational force of Shia, Sunni, Christian, Yazidi, Alawite, Druze, and Kurdish fighters, a coalition built specifically to dismantle ISIS. But what can I do? Some so-called intellectuals laugh and think that we are fighting for the survival of one person, namely Bashar. They do not realize that this is a front for the defense of humanity, not merely for the defense of Islam. It is a front for the defense of Islam, not merely for the defense of Shia. For this he was hailed as a savior by his allies, and was deemed an unparalleled threat by his foes. It was precisely this ability to mobilize his diverse network against the Takfiris that made him a primary target for Netanyahu and Trump. Iran's strategy in Syria was defined by a deliberate and public duality. It drew a sharp operational distinction between armed Takfiri groups seen as an existential threat and those viewed as a political challenge. The latter included other opposition factions, but also those within the Takfiri spectrum who were prepared to negotiate. These were treated as adversaries with whom a solution, however complicated, remained possible. This nuanced policy was best exemplified by Iran's pivotal role in the Syrian government's reconciliation and evacuation agreements. These deals, particularly the Iranian protected evacuation of Takfiris and other opposition groups from eastern Aleppo in late 2016, came at a cost. Iran sacrificed its own personnel to secure it. The outcome, therefore, represented not merely a military victory, but a humanitarian, moral, political, and strategic success. Another critical component of Iran's narrative, omitted from mainstream discourse, is the significant drawdown of its conventional military advisors after the territorial defeat of ISIS in late 2017. This reduction disproves the claim that Iran sought a permanent, large-scale presence of Syria. Its model instead shifted to a low-profile presence, advisors and garrisons in strategic locations. It reduced Iran's exposure and costs while preserving its core security network, embedded advisors, loyal militias in key zones, and institutionalized intelligence sharing. A question arises. Why did Iran not launch a large-scale military intervention to save Assad in 2024? The answer lies in the principles that guided Iran's involvement from the start. Contrary to the Western narrative of expansionist occupation, Iran's mission was never to fight Syria's war for it. Its intervention was strictly conditional upon two pillars: a formal sovereign request from the recognized state, the demonstrable will of the local army and population to resist. In late 2024, according to Iranian officials, neither condition was met. The Syrian government issued no formal plea for an intervention, and critical sections of the state and society displayed no will for a conclusive defense. Without this essential local anchor, Iran therefore deemed any large-scale intervention not only futile, but potentially detrimental. For years, Iranian intelligence had warned Damascus of emerging threats, providing alerts on the movement and consolidation of extremist factions. Following the territorial defeat of Daesh, Iran had already drawn down its major combat forces. Damascus, for its own reasons, including a naive desire for rapprochement with the U.S., had little incentive to reverse that trend. A rapid, decisive reinforcement was therefore impossible. Iran lacked the on-the-ground structure and, critically, a reliable local partner to receive and sustain it. This underscores a strategic consistency. Iran provided intelligence and advisors to defend the state against U.S.-backed Takfiri forces, but it would not become an army of occupation to save a leader whose own pillars of support had crumbled. The survival of Bashar al-Assad personally was never Iran's immutable doctrine. The current situation in Syria is abysmal. The Zionist regime controls critical territories in the south, Erdogan controls much of the north, and the United States and its proxies dominate the northeast and east. There is little security, and the slaughter and demonization of minorities and moderates are not incidental, but a feature. The leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham enjoyed a public love fest with retired General Petraeus, played basketball with the head of CENTCOM, and secured a discreet, bizarre audience at the White House with Trump. These facts, among others, prove that Iran and the axis of resistance were right all along. This dirty war was never for the sake of the Syrian people. It was a geopolitical gambit to reshape the region, with the primary beneficiary being the Zionist project. Nevertheless, there is a profound strategic outcome. The NATO-backed Takfiri project had been severely weakened. Iraq and Lebanon, though fragile, were saved from its full onslaught. The regional regimes that once armed these very extremists now stand exposed, having done absolutely nothing for Gaza, while the axis of resistance has made extraordinary sacrifices for Palestine. Perhaps, after all these events, a real Arab Spring or awakening is not as far-fetched as some believe. See you next week.